The wind in Kansas didn't just blow. It screamed. It came across the flat, dark land of 1887 with the sound of a mourning woman, ripping at the fine silk of Clara's traveling dress. The fabric, already ruined by mud and thorns, snagged on a branch of switchgrass and tore with a sound like a muted cry. She ignored it. She only bent lower over the neck of the mare, urging the animal onward, though the horse was near spent. Its breath came in ragged, steaming clouds, and its hooves slipped and sucked in the freezing mud. Clara's hands were slick, but not just from the rain. They were sticky with drying blood. Her blood, and his. The guard, a man paid by her father, had caught her by the stable door. He had grabbed her arm, his fingers biting into her skin, his voice low and threatening. She had not screamed. She had simply seized the iron fireplace poker she had hidden in the folds of her skirt and brought it down against the side of his head. There had been a wet, heavy sound, like a melon splitting, and he had collapsed without a word. She had stared at the blood on her knuckles for only a second before running. That felt like a lifetime ago. It had only been 3, maybe 4 hours. Now, the adrenaline was gone, leaving only a hollow, vibrating terror and a cold that settled deep in her bones. The storm had broken half an hour ago, a deluge of icy rain and rumbling thunder that turned the prairie into a black, chaotic sea. She was lost. The small creek she had been following, the one she prayed would lead her south, had vanished, swallowed by the rising water and the impenetrable dark. The mare stumbled, pitching forward, and Clara was thrown hard against the pommel. She cried out, a thin sound swallowed by the wind, and fought to keep the horse upright. "No, no, please," she whispered, patting the horse's neck with her ruined hands. "Just a little longer, just shelter." As if the land itself heard her plea. A flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating the horizon for one stark, white second, and there, not 500 yards distant, stood a shape. It was low and sagging, a dark block against the gray sky. A barn. It looked abandoned, forgotten by whatever homestead had once stood nearby. It was shelter. She kicked the mare's ribs, the horse finding one last reserve of strength. They moved through the sucking mud, the sound of the wind howling over the broken roof growing louder. The barn was perched on a slight rise, which had kept it from flooding, though the ground around it was a mire. Clara slid from the saddle, her legs buckling. She was trembling so violently she could barely stand. The mare nudged her, exhausted. Clara fumbled with the reins, her fingers numb, and tied them loosely to a broken fence post. The main barn door was missing, hanging off one hinge, leaving a gap wide enough for a man. She peered into the blackness. It smelled of old hay, damp earth, and something animal. "Hello?" she called, her voice thin. Only the wind answered, whistling through the gaps in the planking. She pulled her torn skirt tight and stepped inside, out of the worst of the rain. The darkness was absolute. She moved forward, shuffling, her hands outstretched, until her fingers brushed against dry, prickly hay. She was about to sink down, to finally give in to the exhaustion, when a sound stopped her. It was not the wind, it was not the rain. It was the quiet, metallic click of a revolver hammer being drawn back. Clara froze. The sound seemed to echo in the small space, louder than the thunder outside. "Don't take another step," a voice said. It was low, rough, and held no trace of mercy. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't see him. He was somewhere in the blackness, in the deeper shadows of the stalls. "I ain't got anything," she stammered, her voice cracking. "Please, I'm just looking for shelter from the storm." "That's what they all say," the man's voice replied. He sounded tired. "Who are you? Who's with you?" "No one. I'm alone." A flash of lightning illuminated the interior, freezing the scene. He was there, not 20 feet away, half hidden behind a rotted support beam. He was tall, dressed in a heavy, drenched duster. A sodden hat was pulled low. All she could see was the glint of his eyes and the long, steady barrel of the pistol pointed directly at her heart. She saw the gun. He saw her. He must have seen the ruined dress, the mud caked to her legs, the blood on her hands, the terror in her eyes, but his hand did not waver. The darkness crashed back in, heavier this time. "Turn around," he commanded. "Slow, and leave." "I can't," she whispered. The fight was gone. The image of the gun, the memory of the guard, the hours of running, it all crested at once. "The storm, my horse, please." "That ain't my problem." She tried to take a step back, to obey, but her body had nothing left. The cold, the hunger, and the stark, final terror of that gun barrel broke her. Her vision tunneled. The smell of wet hay filled her nostrils. "Please," she whispered one last time, but the word was barely air. She didn't faint. She crumpled. Her knees hit the dirt floor, and she pitched forward into the hay, the darkness inside her head finally matching the darkness of the barn. Luke watched her fall. He kept the gun steady for a full 10 seconds, listening. He heard the wind. He heard the rain. He heard the shuddering, weak gasps of the woman on the floor. He heard no one else, no horses, no posse. He cursed, low and long, under his breath. This was trouble. This was the last thing he needed. He was running his own race. And a woman, especially a woman who looked like that, was an anchor he couldn't afford. He waited another minute. The gun still raised. She didn't move. She just lay there, a heap of expensive, torn silk and mud. Finally, he thumbed the hammer down, the click soft this time, and slid the revolver back into its worn holster. He moved slowly, his boots making no sound on the dirt floor. He knelt beside her, checking the darkness around them one last time before striking a match. The small flame flared, casting huge, dancing shadows. Her face was pale, smeared with dirt. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was plastered to her cheeks. Her hands, curled near her face, were raw and scraped, the knuckles dark with dried blood, not just her own. He frowned. This was complicated trouble. She moaned, a sound of pure misery, and shivered. Her lips were blue. Luke sighed. He looked toward the door, toward the storm, and then back at her. He couldn't leave her. Even he wasn't that far gone. He moved to the corner where his saddlebags lay. He had a small cache of dry kindling wrapped in an oilcloth. He worked with practiced efficiency, shaving slivers from a dry beam with his knife, striking another match and carefully nursing the flame. It caught, smoke stinging his eyes before the small fire took hold, casting a weak, orange glow. He looked at her again. She was still unconscious, or perhaps just too exhausted to move. He retrieved his bedroll and pulled out the heavy wool blanket. It smelled of horse and old sweat, but it was dry. He tossed it over her, not bothering to be gentle. She stirred at the contact, her eyes fluttering open. They were wide and terrified, finding his face in the firelight. She tried to scramble back, but she was too weak. "Easy," he said, his voice flat. "You're freezing." She just stared at him, her breathing shallow. He looked away first, uncomfortable under the gaze. He went back to his saddlebag and pulled out the last of his provisions, half a loaf of stale bread. It was hard as a rock. He tossed it onto the hay beside her. "It's all I got." Clara stared at the bread, then at the fire, then at him. He had taken off his hat. His hair was dark and shaggy, his face angular and covered in a rough beard of several days' growth. He was lean, but the breadth of his shoulders was evident even through the damp duster. His eyes were the color of slate, and they held no warmth at all. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and expected worse. She flinched as he moved, but he only went to the other side of the small fire. He sat on his bedroll, his back against a stall post, and pulled his rifle from its scabbard. He began the methodical, calming ritual of cleaning it, pushing a greased patch through the barrel, his hands deft and sure. The barn was silent save for the hiss of the rain, the howl of the wind, and the crackle of the fire. The meager flames pushed back the chill, and the heavy blanket began to chase the deep cold from Clara's limbs. Her stomach cramped with a hunger so sharp it was painful. She looked at the bread. Her hands were filthy. She rubbed them on her torn skirt, wincing as the rough fabric scraped her raw knuckles. She picked up the bread and tore at it with her teeth. It was dry and tasteless, but it was food. She ate slowly, painfully, forcing her throat to swallow. They sat in silence for a long time. The man never looked up from his rifle, but she knew he was aware of her every move. The tension was thick, a physical thing hanging in the air between them. She finished the bread, the small portion only serving to sharpen her hunger. She pulled the blanket tighter, the rough wool scratching her chin. "Who are you running from?" he asked, his voice quiet, not looking up from the rifle's breech. Clara stiffened. She looked at the blood on her hands, dark in the firelight. "I'm not running from anyone." He stopped cleaning. He raised his eyes, and they pinned her. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her, at the dress, at her hands. The silence was his answer. She looked away, toward the flames. "I can't go back," she said, the words barely a whisper. I can't." He held her gaze for another moment, then seemed to find an answer. Or perhaps he just decided he didn't care. He nodded once, a short, sharp movement, and returned his attention to the rifle. The unspoken agreement settled between them. He wouldn't ask any more questions. She wouldn't be any more trouble. The fire burned low. The man finished with his rifle, checked his pistol again, and then spread his bedroll on the opposite side of the barn, a good 15 feet away. He lay down, using his saddle as a pillow, and pulled his hat over his eyes. In minutes, his breathing deepened, though Clara suspected he wasn't truly asleep. She stayed by the fire, soaking up the last of the warmth. But the kindling was gone, and the damp logs he'd found smoked more than they burned. The fire died, shrinking to a bed of pale red embers. The cold returned almost instantly. It swept in through the broken planks, a tangible, biting presence. The wind had not died down. It seemed to gain strength as the night deepened, the temperature dropping steadily. The blanket was heavy, but the cold seeped through it, finding her skin, her bones. She began to shiver. At first, it was just a tremor, but as the minutes stretched into an hour, it became a violent, uncontrollable shaking. Her teeth chattered so loudly she was afraid it would wake him. She looked over at the man. He was a long, dark shape in the gloom, seemingly unaffected by the cold. He had the bedroll, and he was sleeping on a thick pile of hay, insulated from the frozen ground. She was on the bare, cold dirt. She tried to curl into a ball, pulling her knees to her chest, but it didn't help. The cold was relentless. It was more than uncomfortable. It was becoming dangerous. She looked at the man again. He represented danger. He had a gun and a hard face, and he had made it clear he wanted nothing to do with her. But he was warm. She debated for what felt like an eternity. Pride warred with survival. The memory of the gun warred with the agonizing, aching cold. The cold won, slowly, trying to make no sound. Clara got to her hands and knees. The blanket trailed behind her. She crawled across the distance separating them, her movement stiff, her whole body shaking. The hay rustled beneath her. She heard the man's breathing stop. He was awake. He was listening. She froze, halfway there, terrified. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just lay there, perfectly still, under his hat. She waited. The wind howled, and a blast of icy air shot through the gap in the door, stinging her face. She shivered so hard her jaw ached. She had to move. She crawled the last few feet. She stopped just shy of his bedroll. in the deep, loose hay beside him. She huddled there, pulling the blanket tight, still shaking, the small, residual warmth from his body. Trapped in the hay was a blessing. It wasn't enough, but it was something. She lay there, miserable, for several minutes. He still hadn't moved. Then his voice came from the darkness, low and rough. "Get in the hay, not on it." She hesitated, then understood. She pushed aside the top layer of hay, burrowing into the dryer, warmer straw beneath, pulling her wool blanket in with her. It was warmer, insulated from the wind. She settled, her back to him, near his bedroll but not touching. The shaking began to subside, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. She was still cold, but she knew she wouldn't freeze. She lay awake, listening to the storm and the breathing of the dangerous man beside her, and wondered if she had escaped one prison only to find herself in another. Clara woke to the smell of wood smoke and chicory. It was a harsh, bitter smell, but it was warm. She was stiff, her body aching from the cold ground and the hard ride, but the violent shiver was gone. She was buried in hay, the heavy wool blanket cocooning her. She opened her eyes. The barn was gray with morning light. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that dripped. Rainwater ran in steady streams from the dozen holes in the roof, puddling on the dirt floor. The cowboy, Luke, was crouched by a small, efficient fire, a blackened tin pot perched on a rock at its edge. He was watching the pot, his expression unreadable. He had not slept in his duster. He wore a faded flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up his forearms. He seemed to fill the small space with a quiet, coiled energy. He heard the rustle of her moving. He didn't look up, but his hand moved to the tin cup resting near his boot. He dipped it into the pot, steam rising in the cool air, and then pushed it across the dirt toward her. "It's coffee," he said. His voice was rough from sleep. "It'll warm you." She pushed herself out of the hay. The blanket clutched around her shoulders. Her dress was a stiff, ruined mess of mud and torn silk. She felt the shame of her appearance, then pushed it down. Shame was a luxury. She crawled toward the fire and took the cup. Her hands were still scraped raw, and the hot tin made her wince, but the heat was life. She sipped. The coffee was scalding and black, so bitter it made her eyes water. It tasted of burnt grain and earth, but it was hot. It burned a path straight to her stomach, and she welcomed it. He took his own cup and drank, staring into the flames. The silence stretched, filled only by the rhythmic dripping of the rain. "You cried out in your sleep," he said, still not looking at her. Clara's hand tightened on the cup. She had no memory of it. "I don't remember." "You said a name, over and over." She went cold. "Garrett." She said nothing. She just stared at the fire, her throat closing. "And you were fighting," he added, his voice flat. "Who's Garrett?" She flinched, a small, violent movement that sloshed coffee onto her hand. She barely felt the burn. "He is no one." Luke finally turned his head. His gray eyes settled on her, and she felt pinned. He looked at her ruined hands, the bruise forming on her cheek where the guard had grabbed her, the terror that she knew must still be in her eyes. He didn't believe her, but he didn't press. He just turned back to the fire, a small, hard line setting in his jaw. He had offered a chance, and she had refused it. The wall between them was back, solid as stone. The morning wore on. The rain didn't stop. It settled into a cold, persistent drizzle. Luke went out to check on the horses. Clara watched him through the broken door. His own horse, a lean, tough-looking buckskin, seemed fine. Her mare, however, was favoring its front left leg, a slight limp from the desperate run. Luke returned, his hat and duster soaked again. He shed them by the fire, water pooling around his boots. His shirt was damp, plastered to his chest and back. He muttered a curse and went to his saddlebag. pulling out a stained, dry shirt, the only other one he seemed to possess. He turned his back to her and pulled the wet shirt off over his head. Clara, who had been trying to look anywhere else, found her gaze drawn to him. The firelight played over the skin of his back, the muscles shifting as he moved. He was lean, but powerfully built, all rope and sinew, and his skin was a map of old violence. A puckered, pale scar, the size of a small coin, sat high on his left shoulder blade. Another, a long, angry white line, slashed across his ribs on the right side. When he turned to toss the wet shirt aside, she saw his chest. It was worse. 2 more round scars, clearly from bullets, were scattered across his torso, one dangerously close to his heart. A jagged starburst-shaped burn marked his lower abdomen. She had seen farmhands with scars from barbed wire, or the kick of a mule. She had never seen this. This was the work of men, of guns and knives and fire. He caught her staring. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in a kind of weary defensiveness. He didn't bother to cover himself. He just stood there, letting her look. "What?" he asked, his voice low. You're back," she whispered, unable to look away. "What happened?" He picked up the dry shirt and looked at it, not at her. "Occupational hazards." "What occupation?" He gave a short, mirthless laugh. He pulled the clean shirt on, the fabric hiding the stories on his skin. "I used to ride with a man named Elias Thorne. We moved. Merchandise. Rifles to miners, pistols to settlers, sometimes to folks who shouldn't have had them." He sat down, picking up his coffee cup. It was good pay for a while, better than punching cattle for $30 a month and found. "You were in a gang," she said. It wasn't a question. "You could call it that. We called it a business." He drank, his eyes distant. "Thorne got greedy. Decided he didn't like splitting the profits 5 ways. He set us up, a buyer in the Panhandle. Supposed to be a big sale. It was an ambush. Thorne and the buyer took the guns, the money, and left me and 2 others for the buzzards. I was the only one who got out." He tapped the spot on his chest, the one near his heart. This one was from Thorne himself, a parting gift. He fell silent. The story finished. He was telling her. She realized, to warn her, to let her know what kind of man she was trapped with. She was not a lady of quality taking shelter with a gentleman. She was a fugitive, hiding with a killer. The revelation should have terrified her. Strangely, it did not. It settled a kind of grim understanding between them. They were both running. "I am sorry," she said quietly. He looked at her, surprised. "Don't be. I made my bed. I'm just trying not to die in it." A loud drip and a small splash near her foot made her jump. A new leak had sprung in the roof, directly over their small, dry patch of hay. Another drop followed, then another. Luke swore, looking up at the rotten rafters. "Damn it, that's the last dry spot." He stood up and surveyed the roof. "There's some old planking in the far stall. If we can cover that hole, we might stay dry." He waded through the mud to the other side of the barn and returned with 2 long, warped boards. He looked up, judging the height. "I can't reach it from the ground," he said. "I'll have to climb the stall." He wedged one board into the dirt, leaning it against the rotted support beam. He handed the other to Clara. "I'll get up there. You hand this to me when I'm set." Clara nodded, her hands tightening on the rough, damp wood. Luke climbed the side of the stall, his boots slipping on the wet wood. He moved like a cat, testing each foothold before putting his weight on it. He reached the crossbeam, balancing precariously 12 feet above the floor. The old wood groaned under his weight. "All right," he called down, his voice tight with concentration. "Hand it up, easy." Clara lifted the heavy board. It was awkward, and she had to stretch onto her toes to get it high enough. He leaned down, his fingers straining to reach it. The beam he was standing on was slick with moss and rain. "A little higher," he said, grunting. She pushed, rising up, her arms shaking from the weight. It happened fast. His boot slipped. She heard the sharp crack of the wood, a muffled curse. He didn't fall clean. He twisted, trying to regain his balance, but his momentum was gone. He came crashing down, a tangle of long limbs, and slammed into her. The force of his weight drove the air from her lungs. She screamed, and they both went down, tumbling into the largest, driest pile of hay. She landed on her back, the hay cushioning the worst of the impact, but he landed on top of her. The world stopped. The barn was silent save for the dripping rain. All she could feel was him. He was heavy, solid muscle and bone, pressing her deep into the straw. His chest was hard against her own, and his breath was hot on her cheek. One of his legs was tangled between hers, the rough denim of his jeans abrasive against her ruined dress. Her hands were trapped between them, pressed flat against the solid wall of his chest. She could feel his heart, hammering a fast, heavy beat against her palms. He had braced himself on his elbows, taking most of his weight, but he was still covering her, still touching her everywhere. She could smell him, rain, wet wool, coffee, and a faint, masculine scent of sweat and leather. She stared up at him, her eyes wide. He was staring down at her, his face inches from hers. His gray eyes were no longer cold or flat. They were dark, intense, and fixed on her mouth. Neither of them moved for a full 10 seconds. It felt like an hour. The barn, the storm, the running, it all faded away, leaving only this man, this weight, this heat. Clara's heart, which she thought had stopped, suddenly kicked, a wild, painful throb in her chest. A strange, terrifying warmth uncurled deep in her belly. Luke's breath hitched. He saw the shift in her expression, the flicker of something that was not fear. He broke the spell. He pushed himself off her in a single, violent movement, rolling away and scrambling to his feet. He was breathing hard, his fists clenched at his sides. "I'm sorry," he bit out, the words harsh. "Are you hurt?" Clara sat up slowly, pulling hay from her hair, her entire body trembling. "No, I am fine." She was not fine. She was confused, and her skin burned where he had touched her. She felt lightheaded, and the fear that returned was not of him, but of the feeling he had sparked. It was a feeling she had been taught was base, animal, and wrong, and it was the first thing she had truly felt, besides terror, in months. Luke turned his back on her, running a hand through his damp hair. "We'll leave the damn roof." He walked to the far side of the barn, as far as he could get from her, and busied himself with his saddle, checking straps that did not need checking. Clara wrapped her arms around her knees. She could still feel the imprint of his body. She watched him, the straight, tense line of his back. He did not look at her again for the rest of the day, but she felt his eyes on her when he thought she was not looking. A quick, guarded glance, then away. The day bled into a long, cold evening. The rain finally eased, but the temperature plummeted as the sun went down. The cold crept back into the barn, more potent than the night before. They built the fire, their movements stiff and awkward, careful not to brush hands. The silence was heavier now, charged with the memory of the fall. When it was time to sleep, there was no discussion. There was one bedroll and one wool blanket. To sleep apart was to freeze. Luke laid his bedroll near the fire and spread the blanket over it. He lay down on one side, on the bare hay, leaving the thicker padding of the bedroll for her. He turned his back to the space she would occupy. Clara hesitated for a long time, but the cold was biting. She lay down on the bedroll, her back to his back. The space between them was only a few inches, but it felt like a canyon. She pulled a corner of the blanket over her. He reached back, his hand brushing her shoulder, and pulled the rest of the blanket over them both, tucking it in around her. His touch was impersonal, brief, but it sent a jolt through her. They lay like that, two straight, rigid lines in the dark, listening to the fire crackle. The warmth of his body radiated across the small gap, heating her back. It was comforting, and it was agonizing. "This man," Clara said, her voice so low it was almost lost in the wind. "The one you heard me name." Luke went very still. He did not turn. "Garrett!" "My father. He owns a large tract of land, but he is in debt to Mr. Garrett, deep in debt." She spoke to the dancing shadows on the far wall. "Mr. Garrett is an old man. He is cold. He has buried 2 wives." She paused, the words sticking in her throat. "He offered to forgive my father's debt in exchange for the land and for me. A marriage contract. I was part of the property." Luke said nothing, but she felt him listening. "I was to be married in 2 days. I am not a person to them. I am a deed, a way to settle a score." Her voice broke, the humiliation and rage rising. "I hit the guard. I think I may have killed him. And I ran, because I will not." She took a shuddering breath, the words tearing out of her. "I don't want to be property anymore." The confession hung in the air, raw and bleeding. She had never spoken it aloud. She began to tremble, the fear and the cold and the shame mixing into one terrible, shaking palsy. She felt him shift. He rolled onto his back, then slightly onto his side, to face her. She kept her back to him, but she could feel his breath on her hair. She was so cold, so scared, and she was so terribly, terribly alone. She wanted, more than anything, to turn, to press her face into his chest, to feel the warmth of another living, breathing person who was not trying to buy or sell her. But she was terrified. The only touch she had ever known from a man, besides her father's distant pats, was the guard's bruising grip. Her fear of Garrett was a cold dread of the wedding night, of what would be taken from her. She was shaking, and a new, confusing feeling was mixed in. The memory of his weight on her, the heat. It was desire, but it was tangled so tightly with terror. She could not separate them. She was testing him, testing this fragile safety. She turned, slowly, to face him. In the dim firelight, his face was all shadows and angles. His eyes were watching her, waiting. The trembling became violent. She spoke, her voice a shattered whisper, the words from a place of deep trauma, a reflex of pain and a desperate, confused plea. "Please stop. I can only take 3 inches in." The words made no sense in the context of the moment, yet they said everything. They spoke of violation, of pain, of being treated as an object. It was a shield, and it was a test. Luke's expression did not change. He did not flinch, did not question her. He simply watched her, his eyes full of a strange, deep sorrow she did not understand. He saw her, not the words, but the raw, animal fear beneath them. He did not move toward her. He did not try to touch her body. He waited a beat, letting the broken words hang in the air. And then, very slowly, he lifted his hand. It was calloused, rough from reins and ropes. He placed it gently against her face, his palm cupping her jaw, his thumb moving to stroke the damp hair back from her temple. The touch was so tender, so devoid of demand, it broke something inside her. A sob escaped her, silent and painful. He said nothing. He just held her face, his gaze steady, letting her know he was not Garrett. He was not her father. He was not the guard. After a long moment, he drew his hand back. He reached down and gripped the edge of the wool blanket. He pulled it up, over her shoulder, over his own, tucking it tightly around them both. He settled back onto his back, and she settled facing him, their bodies close, sharing the same small pocket of warmth, but not pressing. The shaking slowly subsided. The emotions were too big for the small barn, dousing them both in a profound, exhausted silence. They lay awake for a long time, breathing in the same cold air, 2 feet from the fire, 2 inches from each other. And for the first time in her life, Clara felt something that resembled safety. The light that woke them was gray and cold, filtered through the high, dirty cracks in the barn walls. The storm had broken, but the world outside was a sodden, dripping mess. For a long moment, Clara didn't move. She was intensely aware of the man beside her. They had slept close, tucked under the single blanket, but had not touched after he'd settled her. The warmth from his body had been the only thing keeping the deep chill at bay. Luke was already moving. He slid out from the blanket, taking the warmth with him, and Clara felt the cold rush in. He stood, stretched his back with a quiet groan, and put his hat on, his movements economical and practiced. He did not look at her. He went straight to the barn door to check on the horses. Clara sat up, pulling the blanket around her. Her body ached. She felt the heavy weight of her confession, the vulnerability of her words. She had told him everything. She had told him things she had never even formed as thoughts in her own mind, and he had simply accepted it. He had offered his hand, and then his warmth, and asked for nothing. A low, worried whinny came from outside. She got to her feet, the stiff, muddy silk of her dress crackling. She went to the door. Luke was standing with her mare, his hand running down the animal's front left leg. The horse was favoring it, refusing to put its full weight down. "She's lame," he said, his voice flat. He looked up at Clara, and his gaze was professional, distant. Last night might not have happened. We're not going anywhere on her today. Clara's heart sank. "Is it broken?" "No," he said, squatting to feel the fetlock. The mare shied, and he calmed it with a low, rumbling word. "Looks like a bad sprain. She must have twisted it in the mud. In the dark. She needs it cleaned and wrapped. And she needs rest." Clara came outside, ignoring the sucking mud that pulled at her ruined shoes. This was her fault, her escape, her responsibility. "What do we do?" He looked at her, then at his own buckskin, which was watching them with mild interest. "We wait. I'll need to clean it. Need hot water, and rags, clean ones, if you've got them." Rags. She looked down at her dress. It was already destroyed. She bunched the hem of her petticoat, the last clean white thing she owned, and pulled the small pocket knife she'd carried from her belt. She began sawing at the fine linen. Luke watched her for a second, a flicker of something, respect, maybe, in his eyes. He turned and went back inside to get the fire going and heat water in the blackened tin pot. When he returned, she had a pile of white strips. He nodded once. "Hold her head. Keep her calm." Clara went to the mare's head, stroking its nose, whispering to it. The horse was nervous, its eyes wide. Luke was surprisingly gentle. He dipped one of the linen strips into the steaming water, testing the heat against his own wrist before pressing it to the swollen joint. The mare flinched, but Luke's hand was firm and steady, his voice a low, constant murmur. "Easy, girl, easy now." They worked together in silence. Clara kept the horse steady, her voice the only sound. Luke cleaned the mud and grit from the sprain, his movements efficient, his touch sure. He tore another strip of cloth and soaked it in the cold, muddy water from the rain barrel, applying it as a cold compress. Their hands brushed as she passed him a new cloth. His fingers were rough, calloused, but his touch on the animal was tender. She found herself watching his hands, the way he worked, with a competence that was both reassuring and intimidating. When he was satisfied, he took a small tin of axle grease from his saddlebag. "It's not proper," he said, "but it'll keep the water out." He smeared a thick layer over the joint, then used the last of the linen to wrap it tightly. The job was done. The mare stood, still wary, but the leg was clean and bound. Luke stood up, wiping his greasy hands on his denim-clad thighs. He looked at Clara. Her hair was matted with hay. Her face was smudged with dirt, and the hem of her dress and petticoat were torn to ribbons. A small, Strange sound escaped him. It was a dry, rusty sound, as if the mechanism for it had not been used in years. It was a laugh. "Well," he said, the corner of his mouth ticking upward, "you don't look like a lady of property anymore." Clara looked down at herself. She was a mess. Mud caked her arms, and she was sure she smelled of wet horse and grease. She looked up at him, at his rough beard and the dark, wary eyes that were, for the first time, softened with something other than pity. A bubble of pure, hysterical lightness rose in her chest. She had survived the night. She was not in Garrett's house. She was standing in the mud with a wanted man, and she was free. A small, breathy laugh escaped her lips. It was as rusty as his. "Neither do you, Cowboy." The moment hung in the air, fragile and bright. They looked at each other, not as a fugitive and a killer, but as two people. Then the smiles faded, the shared lightness evaporating as the reality of their situation returned. "We're out of coffee," he said, the wall sliding back into place. "And that half loaf of bread is gone. The horse can't be moved for at least a day, maybe 2. I need to get supplies." Fear, cold and sharp, replaced the warmth. "Go! Where?" "There's a settlement, a few miles east, just a crossroads with a general store. I saw the smoke from it yesterday before the storm hit." "You're leaving me here." The panic was stark in her voice. He looked at her, his expression hard. "I'm coming back, but we can't stay here and starve. And that mare needs oats if she's going to heal." He turned and went to his saddle. He pulled his rifle from the scabbard. He checked the load, then held it out to her. "Butt first." Clara stared at it. "Do you know how to use it?" he asked. "My father taught me to shoot at bottles, not people." "It's the same," he said flatly. "You point it at what you don't want to get near you, and you pull the trigger. There's a round in the chamber. Don't touch this." He tapped the trigger. "Unless you mean to use it, barricade the door after I'm gone. Don't open it for anyone but me." She took the rifle. It was heavy, the wood smooth, the metal cold. It was the first time in her life she had felt the solid weight of her own defense. He holstered his pistol, pulled his hat low, and swung onto his buckskin. "I'll be back in 2 hours, 3 at the most. Stay out of sight." He didn't look back. He nudged the horse into a trot and disappeared over the muddy rise. Clara was alone. She dragged a broken stall door in front of the main opening, leaving a gap just big enough to see through. She sat on the hay bale, the rifle across her knees, and waited. Every gust of wind, every drip of water, every creak of the old barn made her heart leap into her throat. Luke rode with his head down. The duster pulled tight. The town was exactly as he'd expected. A handful of false-fronted buildings sinking into a sea of mud. A general store, a saloon, and a livery stable. A single horse was hitched outside the saloon. He dismounted, tied his horse, and pushed his way into the general store. It smelled of tobacco, burlap, and aging cheese. An old man with spectacles sat behind the counter. "Help you?" the man asked. "Coffee," Luke said, his voice low. "Bacon, oats, some hardtack, and bandages. Whatever you've got." The storekeeper nodded, shuffling to collect the items. Luke kept his back to the wall, his eyes on the street. He felt exposed. "That'll be $3.20, the storekeeper said. Luke pulled the coins from his pocket, counting them onto the counter. As he was bagging the supplies, the door opened. A man slouched in. He was thin, with a greasy coat and eyes that were too close together. He was looking for tobacco, but he stopped when he saw Luke. He squinted. "Say," the man said, his voice wheedling, "I know you." Luke froze. He didn't turn. "You're mistaken." "No, I ain't," the man said, taking a step closer. He smelled of sour whiskey. "I'd know that face anywhere. You're Luke, the one who shot up Elias Thorne's crew. I was in the Panhandle last year. Saw a poster. There's a reward. $500. The storekeeper looked up, his eyes wide. Luke turned, very slowly. I said, "You're mistaken." "I ain't," the man said, grinning, showing rotten teeth. $500. I reckon the marshal in Hayes City would be real interested to know you're here. Luke moved, fast as a snake. He grabbed the man by the front of his coat, slamming him back against a barrel of pickles. The man's grin vanished, replaced by fear. "You didn't see me," Luke snarled, his face inches from the man's. "I was never here. You say one word, and I will come back, and you won't live to spend a single cent of that reward. Do you understand me?" The man, his eyes bulging, nodded frantically. Luke shoved him, sending him sprawling into a stack of flour sacks. He grabbed his supplies, threw the money on the counter, and backed out of the store. He was untying his horse when the man came flying out of the store, not at him, but screaming. "That's him! That's the one! Luke, there's a reward!" The saloon door burst open. Two men, ranchers by their look, came out, hands on their pistols. "Damn it!" Luke breathed. He swung into the saddle. A shot rang out, kicking up mud by his horse's hoof. "He's getting away!" Luke didn't look back. He kicked the buckskin into a gallop, bending low over its neck. He heard another shot, the whine of the bullet passing well wide. He cleared the edge of the small town and disappeared into the tall grass of the prairie, his heart hammering with a cold, familiar fury. He was recognized. He was hunted, and he had just led them right back to Clara. He took a long, circular route back to the barn, hoping to throw off any immediate pursuit. He was angry at himself, at the man in the store, at the world. He was poison. He knew it. Clara heard the hoofbeats and her heart seized. She raised the rifle, her hands shaking, and peered through the crack. It was him. She dragged the stall door away as he rode straight into the barn. His horse lathered. He swung down, pulling the saddlebags with him. "We have to go," he said, his voice grim. "Now." "What happened? Why?" "I was seen, recognized." He was pulling the saddle from his horse, his movements jerky and violent. "Are they coming?" "Not yet, but they will be. They know I'm in the area. They'll form a posse." It was then she saw it, on his left shoulder, high up near the collar. His duster was dark and wet. It wasn't mud. "You're hurt," she whispered, stepping toward him. "You're bleeding." Luke glanced down, as if just remembering. "It's nothing. A scrape. One of them got off a lucky shot." "A shot?" Her voice was thin. "They were shooting at you." "It's nothing," he repeated, harsher this time. He turned his back to her, busying himself with the supplies. He was hiding it, hiding how bad it was. He was lying. The lie was worse than the truth. The fragile trust, the shared laugh. It all evaporated. The world was crashing in, and he was trying to shut her out. The rest of the day was a blur of silent, panicked preparations. He checked her mare. The horse was still limping badly. "She can't run," he said, his voice tight with a frustration that wasn't aimed at her. "Damn it!" "Then we can't run," Clara said. He slammed his fist against the barn wall. You can't. They're not looking for you." "You don't know that," she said, her voice shaking with a new, cold anger. "Garrett will be looking. My father will be looking. They'll have men everywhere. I'm just as wanted as you are." He stopped, his back to her. He hadn't considered that. He was so used to running his own race. He'd forgotten she was running one too. Night fell. The cold returned. The rain started again, a slow, miserable drizzle. They were trapped. They ate the bacon he'd bought, cooked over a low fire. The silence thick and bitter. He'd taken off his duster, and she could see the makeshift bandage he'd applied, which was already stained. After they ate, he climbed the ladder to the hayloft, taking the single lantern with him. She thought he was checking the roof, or maybe just getting away from her. She sat by the fire, the rifle in her lap. She was terrified. She was terrified of the men from the town, of Garrett, of the future. But most of all, she was terrified of him leaving her. He was poison, he'd said, but he was the only safety she knew. She couldn't stand it. She couldn't sit there and wait. She stood up, her legs stiff. She left the rifle and climbed the ladder to the loft. He was not checking the roof. He was standing by the small, square opening that served as a window, looking out over the dark, rain-swept prairie. The lantern sat on a bale beside him, casting him in flickering, golden light. His back was to her. "You lied to me," she said. He stiffened, but did not turn. "It's not a scrape." "No. It's a bullet graze. It just tore the skin. It's nothing. Let me see." "Clara, don't—" His voice was a low warning. She walked toward him, into the pool of lantern light. She stopped in front of him. "Take off your shirt." "No." "Are you going to let it fester?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Are you going to die of a fever in this barn and leave me here alone?" His eyes flashed, angry. He looked at her, at the stubborn set of her jaw. He saw she was not going to back down. With a sigh of defeat, he unbuttoned the flannel shirt, shrugging it off his shoulders, wincing as the fabric pulled at the wound. It was worse than a graze. The bullet had torn a shallow, 4-inch groove along the top of his shoulder. Bloody and raw, it was still weeping blood. "Dear God," she whispered. She went to the supplies he'd bought. She found the bandages and the small bottle of carbolic he'd purchased. "This will hurt," she said, her voice quiet. "I've had worse," he said, sitting on the hay bale. She cleaned the wound. He did not flinch, but his whole body went rigid, his hands clenching into fists on his knees. His skin was hot. She worked quickly, her hands surprisingly steady. She cleaned the blood, applied the stinging antiseptic, and then wrapped the clean white bandage tightly around his shoulder. Her fingers brushed the warm, smooth skin of his chest. She felt the hard muscle beneath. She felt the scars she had seen that morning. When she was done, her hands lingered on his shoulder. He was looking at her, his face only inches away. The lantern light carved hollows under his cheekbones. His eyes were dark, unreadable. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. She did not move. All the pent-up fear, the desperation, the strange, terrifying warmth she'd felt when he fell on her, it all swelled in her chest. He was real. He was bleeding. He was here. He was pushing her away to save her. And she was done being saved. She was done being passive. "You are not poison," she whispered. "Clara," he warned, his voice tight. "Get away from me. I'll only get you killed." "No," she said. She put her hand on his uninjured shoulder, her fingers spreading over the warm skin. "I'm not running from you. I'm not running anymore." She leaned in and kissed him. His lips were hard, unmoving. He was frozen, resisting. His whole body was a coiled spring of denial. She pulled back, looked him in the eyes, and kissed him again. This time, she put her other hand on his chest, feeling his heart hammer against her palm. She kissed him with the desperation of her escape, with the anger at Garrett, with the stark, terrifying knowledge that this might be the only night they had. A low, animal sound tore from his throat. His control shattered. His good arm snaked around her waist, pulling her off her feet and into his lap. His mouth crushed down on hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was raw, starving. It was a kiss of pain and fear and a desperate, agonizing need. It tasted of coffee and gunpowder and the iron tang of his blood. He broke the kiss, his forehead pressed against hers, his breathing ragged. "Don't!" he gasped. "Clara, you don't know. You're not—" "I know exactly what I am doing," she said, her voice shaking but fierce. "I am not property. I am not a child, and I am choosing—" He was sitting on the hay, his back against a support beam. She was on his lap, her legs tangled with his. The moment was suspended, sharp and fragile. He was afraid of hurting her, afraid of himself. She made the choice. She pulled away just enough to look at him. The hay rustled around them. The rain drummed on the roof. The lantern light cast their shadows, huge and dancing on the wall. Slowly, her hands trembling. She reached for the buttons of her own ruined dress. He watched her, his eyes dark, his jaw tight. The dress fell away, pooling around her waist. She was in her thin chemise. She moved, shifting, and straddled him, her knees sinking into the hay on either side of his hips. He sucked in a sharp breath. His hands came up, gripping her waist, his thumbs pressing into the soft skin above her hip bones. He was holding her, anchoring her, but he was letting her lead. She was in control. For the first time in her entire life, she was in control of her own body. She leaned down, her hair falling forward to curtain their faces. "Look at me," she whispered. He did, and she kissed him, slowly this time, a deep, claiming kiss. He responded, his arm pulling her tight, his other hand coming up to tangle in her hair, holding her as if he'd fall if he let go. It was fierce, and it was desperate. It was the frantic, clumsy collision of two people who had nothing left to lose. The hay pricked her bare knees. The cold air raised goosebumps on her arms. But where their bodies touched, she was burning. There were no soft words, only the harsh sound of their breathing, the rustle of the straw, and the steady, weeping drum of the rain outside. It was a release, a rebellion, a desperate, passionate insistence that they were, in this one moment, alive. When it was over, she did not move. She collapsed against his good shoulder, her face buried in his neck, her entire body shuddering. He held her, his arm locked around her, his hand stroking her hair. He was breathing hard, his heart pounding against her chest. He felt the wetness on his neck. "Clara," he whispered, his voice thick. Did I hurt you?" She pulled her head back, and he saw her face in the lantern light. It was slick with tears. She was crying, not the silent, terrified tears of her escape, but deep, racking sobs that shook her from head to toe. She shook her head, unable to speak. "What is it?" he asked, his voice gentle. "No," she finally gasped, the word torn from her. "You didn't hurt me." She wiped her face with a shaking hand. It's the first time." He was confused. The first time?" she whispered, looking him in the eyes, her own raw and bright. "The first time I wasn't property. The first time I was touched like I was a person. The first time I chose." The simple confession hit him harder than the bullet had. He had no words. He just pulled her close, holding her tightly as she cried, letting her finally break, there in the shadows of the hayloft. They stayed like that for a long time. The lantern burned low, the rain eased. Finally, her sobs quieted. She was limp against him, exhausted. He kissed the top of her head. "We leave at first light," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "We have to. That posse will be here by noon tomorrow." She stirred. "But the mare?" "She'll have to walk. We'll go slow, but we have to move." He pushed her hair back from her face. "I'll get you to safety. I promise. We'll cross into Colorado. They don't have paper on me there. We can lose ourselves in the mountains." He promised her safety. He promised her a future. Clara looked past him, at the single square of gray light from the window. She was a ruined woman, fugitive from a forced marriage, who had just given herself to a wanted man in a barn. He was an outlaw with a fresh bullet wound and a price on his head. She didn't believe a person like her could have a future, but as she curled against his warmth, for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to hope. They left the barn in the pre-dawn gray, a cold, wet mist clinging to the ground. There were no words. The intimacy of the hayloft felt like a dream. fragile and unreal in the harsh light of a day meant for running. Luke moved with a stiff, painful economy, his bandaged shoulder a stark white patch against his dark shirt. He saddled his buckskin, then helped Clara onto her mare. The horse was still lame, but the sprain had eased. She could walk. "She can't be pushed," he said, his voice low, his breath clouding in the air. "We'll follow the creek bed. It'll give us cover, but we have to move fast. That posse will be at the barn by noon." Clara nodded, her hands clenched on the reins. She had the rifle, his rifle, slid into the empty scabbard on her saddle. It felt impossibly heavy. The first day was a portrait of misery. They kept to the low ground, the horses' hooves sucking in the mud. The world was a flat, gray expanse of wet grass and skeletal cottonwoods. Luke set a pace that was agonizing, just fast enough to make progress, just slow enough for the mare. Clara's body, already sore, screamed in protest. She was not used to riding, and the night before had left her muscles feeling bruised and strange. But she did not complain. She watched Luke's back. He rode slightly slumped, favoring his left side, and she knew he was in pain. That night, they did not risk a fire. They found a deep washout, a scar in the earth, and led the horses down into the darkness. They ate cold bacon and stale bread, washed down with metallic-tasting water from his canteen. "You need to sleep," he said. He took the first watch. Clara wrapped herself in the single wool blanket and lay on the cold ground. She fell into a tense, dreamless sleep, only to be woken 2 hours later by his hand on her shoulder. "Your turn," he whispered. She sat up, her heart pounding. "What do I do?" "You listen," he said. He handed her his revolver. Her hand instinctively recoiled, but she took it. The metal was cold and heavy. "Anything that sounds like more than one horse, you wake me. Anything that sounds like a man, you wake me. Don't move. Don't make a sound. Just listen." She sat in the dark, the gun in her lap, and listened. She heard the wind in the grass, the sigh of the horses, the quiet sound of Luke breathing in sleep. She was terrified. But as the hours passed, the terror sharpened into a state of raw, heightened awareness. She was protecting him. The realization settled over her, solid and real. When the sky began to gray, he was awake. He took the gun from her, his fingers brushing hers. "You did good." They rode for 3 more days. The land began to change. The flat prairie of Kansas gave way to rolling hills, then to rougher, broken country. They were approaching the border of Colorado. The hardship forged a new silence between them. It was not the awkwardness of the barn. It was the quiet understanding of shared survival. They crossed a river, the water high and fast from the storms. It was Luke's buckskin that found the gravel bar, allowing them to cross without swimming. Clara's mare, panicked, tried to turn back, but Luke grabbed her bridle, his good arm straining, and pulled both horses through the surging, icy water. They emerged on the other side, soaked to the bone, their horses trembling. They were in a thicket of pine and aspen. "We need a fire," Luke said, his teeth chattering. His shoulder was soaked. "We'll get sick if we don't." He set about gathering dry wood from under fallen logs, his movements slower than usual. Clara watched him, useless. "Don't just stand there," he snapped, his voice tight with pain and cold. "Help me." He showed her how to find the driest twigs, how to shave bark, how to build the small structure that would catch a spark. He pulled his flint and steel from his pouch. "Here," he said, handing it to her. "You do it." She tried. She struck the steel against the flint, but the sparks were weak, dying before they hit the tinder. Her hands were numb, clumsy. "Not like that," he said, his patience thin. He grabbed her hand, repositioning the steel. "Hard, fast, angle it down. You're not asking it, you're telling it." She struck again. A spark caught, A tiny wisp of smoke curled up, and then a small, bright orange flame. She stared at it, a fierce, primal surge of triumph rising in her. She had made fire. Luke nodded once. "Good. Now feed it. Slow!" As they dried themselves by the weak, sputtering fire, he took the rifle from her saddle. "That watch was one thing," he said. "This is the other." He spent an hour with her. He made her hold it, feel its balance. He showed her how to load the cartridges, how to work the lever action, how to sight down the barrel. "It's going to kick," he said. "Hard. It'll feel like a mule kicked your shoulder. You let it, you don't fight it, or it'll break your collarbone. You hold it tight to your body, so you and the gun move as one." He set a pine cone on a stump 50 yards away. "Aim small, miss small. Don't pull the trigger. Squeeze it. Slow, like you're squeezing water from a rag." She raised the rifle. It was so heavy, her arms trembled. She lined up the sights, held her breath, and squeezed. The explosion was deafening. The kick was a physical blow, slamming her back a step. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt 10 feet to the left. "Again," he said. She loaded, she fired. This time she was ready for the kick. The shot was closer. Again. She fired 5 times. On the 5th shot, the pine cone vanished in a puff of bark and dust. She lowered the rifle, her shoulder aching, her ears ringing. She looked at him. A slow smile touched his mouth. Not bad at all." The trust between them was no longer a fragile hope. It was a physical thing, built of shared watches and river crossings, of fire and gunpowder. He had stopped treating her like a lady. She had stopped acting like one. She was a woman who could make a fire and hit a target. On the 5th day, they came upon a town. It was barely a town, just a cluster of weathered buildings at a dusty crossroads, nestled in a high valley. It had a livery, a general store, and a 2-story building with a fading sign that read, "The Aspen Ridge Hotel, Rooms and Meals." Luke's shoulder was inflamed, the skin around the bandage an angry red. He was pale. "We need a real roof," he said, his voice quiet. "Just for one night. I need to clean this, and we need real food." "Is it safe?" she asked, her hand instinctively moving to the rifle. "It's Colorado," he said. "My name means nothing here, but we have to look right." He looked at her. Her hair was a tangled mat. Her dress was beyond ruined, caked in mud and torn in a dozen places. She looked like a woman who had been dragged through hell. He looked no better. "They'll ask questions," he said. "We need a story." He dismounted and helped her down. "We're married," he said, his voice flat. "Just married, running from your family. It's close enough to the truth. Let me do the talking." They walked into the hotel. The lobby was small, dusty, and smelled of stale beer and boiled cabbage. A thin man with a green visor was behind the desk, reading a day-old newspaper. He looked up at them over his spectacles. His eyes lingered on Clara, taking in her appearance with open disapproval. "A room," Luke said. He put his good arm on the counter. "For me and my wife." The word sounded strange, heavy. The clerk looked at Clara, then back at Luke. "We don't rent to travelers of your sort. We run a decent house." "My wife is unwell," Luke said, his voice dropping, taking on a hard, dangerous edge. "We've had a hard ride. We just need a bed for the night." "I don't—" Luke's hand moved, so fast Clara almost didn't see it. He grabbed the clerk by his shirt front, pulling him halfway over the desk. "We need a room." The clerk, his face pale, nodded frantically. "Yes, sir. Of course, sir. Room 4, top of the stairs. That'll be 50 cents. Luke dropped the coins on the desk, grabbed the key, and took Clara's arm. He pushed her toward the stairs. The room was small, with a sloping ceiling and a narrow brass bed. A single lamp sat on a washstand, but it was clean, and it was private. "Stay here," Luke said. "Lock the door. I'm going to get food and whiskey. For this." He tapped his shoulder. He left. Clara leaned against the door, the sound of the lock clicking into place echoing the sound of her escape. She was in a room with a bed. She felt weak with relief. She looked around. In the corner, there was a large, battered wooden trunk. It was unlatched. Curiosity, or perhaps just a desperate need for something, anything, clean, made her open it. It was filled with forgotten things. A man's waistcoat, a pair of cracked boots, and at the bottom, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, a dress. It was a wedding dress. It was not silk and lace, like the one she was supposed to have worn for Garrett. It was simple, made of white, homespun cotton, with a small lace collar. Beside it was a short, simple veil of plain netting. Clara touched it, her hand recoiling as if from a snake. It was a sign, a terrible, cruel joke from God. This was the one thing she could not escape. She heard Luke's footsteps on the stairs, his specific knock. She let him in. He was carrying a sack. "Got a stew from the kitchen," he said. He stopped when he saw her. He saw the trunk, the white dress spilled over its edge. He saw her face. "Clara?" "It's a wedding dress," she whispered, her voice choking. He understood immediately. He saw the panic in her eyes, the way she was looking at it like it was a coffin. He set the bag down. "It's just cloth." "It's not," she said, shaking her head. "It's a chain. It's a brand. It's what I was, property." He was silent for a long moment. He walked to the window, looking down at the empty, darkening street. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice quiet. "We have to buy you clothes. You can't ride in that." He gestured to her ruined dress. "I have to sell my spare pistol to get the money. We go to the general store. They'll see us. The clerk already looked at us like we're dirt." He turned to face her. "When they look at you tomorrow, what do you want them to see? A woman in rags, a fugitive, or a new bride?" He walked to the trunk and picked up the dress. "They're looking for a girl who ran. They're not looking for a woman who's married." He held it out. "It's a disguise. Clara, that's all. It's a way to hide." She looked at the dress, then at him. He was right. It was a mask. She took it from him, her hands trembling, while he cleaned his wound, his back to her, wincing as the whiskey stung the raw flesh. She changed. She washed her face and hands in the basin. She took off the filthy, torn silk and put on the simple cotton dress. It fit, almost perfectly. She was buttoning it up when Luke turned around. He stopped, the empty bottle in his hand. She looked different, clean. The simple dress made her look younger, and yet more serious. She was no longer a frantic girl. She was a woman. "It works," he said, his voice rough. They ate the stew, sitting on the edge of the bed. They were too tired to talk. The tension of the town, of the clerk, of what was to come, pressed in on them. After they ate, Luke went back to the window. He stood there for a long time, just watching. Clara saw him. He was watching the street, his hand resting on his pistol. He was on watch. He was protecting her. And then she saw what he was watching. A man was standing across the street, in the shadow of the livery, smoking a cheroot. He was not looking at the hotel, not directly, but he was looking. "Luke," she whispered. "I see him," he said. Clara moved to the window, staying back from the light. She looked at the man. He turned then, as if feeling their eyes, and the weak light from the saloon caught his face. The blood drained from Clara's body. She felt cold, colder than she had in the river. "I know him," she said, her voice dead. "His name is Abernathy. He works for my father. He's one of Garrett's men." Luke did not tense. He did not move. He just continued to watch. "He's seen you." I think so. when we rode in." "He'll be at the telegraph office," Luke said. "Or he's paying a rider. Either way, word is on its way back to Kansas. Garrett will know. He'll know we're in Colorado." "We have to leave," she said, panic rising. "Now." "No," Luke said, his voice calm. "We run now, in the dark. He'll know for sure. He'll raise an alarm. We wait. We leave at first light, just like we planned. Like a normal couple. We act like we didn't see him." He turned from the window and pulled the thin curtain. He looked at her. Her face was a mask of terror. He saw the fugitive again, the girl in the barn. "Clara," he said, gripping her arms. His good hand was firm. "We'll be gone. He's one man. We'll be in the mountains before he can gather a posse. We have one night." One night, the words hung in the small, lamp-lit room. One night of safety, one night in a real bed, and then running again. The knowledge was stark. Tomorrow, they could be caught. Tomorrow, they could be dead. All they had was this room, this flickering light. He was still holding her. She looked at his face, at the lines of exhaustion and pain around his eyes. She thought of the barn. That had been desperation, a claim. This was different. This was a choice. She reached up and touched his face. "Your shoulder," she whispered. "It's fine," he said. "You're a terrible liar," she said. She led him to the bed. She pushed him to sit. She unbuttoned his shirt, her fingers working carefully around the bandage. She got the small tin of salve he'd bought and gently, so gently, tended to the edges of the wound. He watched her, his face grim, but his eyes were soft. When she was done, she did not move away. She knelt on the floor in front of him, her hands resting on his knees. "We have tonight," she said. He looked at her, at the white dress, the wedding dress. A coldness came over his face. I'm not him. Clara, I'm not Garrett. I won't." "I know," she said. She stood up. She went to the washstand and found the small, net veil she had left there. She picked it up, her reflection staring back at her from the small, cracked mirror. She was a bride, but she was her own bride. She turned back to him. He was sitting on the bed, watching her, his body tense. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her hands and took the veil, and just as deliberately, she dropped it. It fluttered to the floor, a small, white pool of netting. She was still. The lamplight was golden, soft, blurring the edges of the poor room. She walked to him. She did not wait for him. She did not ask. She pushed his shirt off his shoulders, letting it fall. She put her hands on his chest, feeling the heat of his skin, the map of his scars. She climbed onto the bed, and just as she had in the barn, she straddled him, her cotton-clad knees sinking into the mattress on either side of his hips. She was in control. He looked up at her, his eyes dark, filled with a raw, aching tenderness. His hands came to her waist, holding her, steadying her. She was his, not by law, not by capture, not by payment, but by choice. She leaned down, her hair falling forward, and her mouth found his. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of the barn. It was slow and deep and sure. It was a promise. It was a claim. It was the only vow that mattered. She pulled back, her forehead resting against his. She was breathing, a soft, sure breath. "This time," she whispered, her voice fierce and low, shaking with the force of her conviction. "I am not anyone else's. I am yours." The night in the small hotel room was a strange, suspended reality. They did not sleep, not truly. They lay under the thin blanket on the brass bed, their bodies pressed together, a silent, desperate affirmation of the choice they had made. Clara was no longer a fugitive, and he was no longer a lone outlaw. They were, in this small, dusty room, simply a man and a woman, holding back the dawn. Luke was in pain. She could feel the heat radiating from his bandaged left shoulder, and he shifted often, his breath catching. Yet, his good arm held her, his hand splayed on her back, a solid, possessive weight. Clara lay with her head on his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. She had never known this simple peace. She had traded a life of suffocating, wealthy imprisonment for a few stolen hours with a wounded man, and she had never felt so rich. Outside, the man named Abernathy was gone. The street was empty, washed in the pale, cold light of the moon, but the threat remained, a silent weight on the air. Dawn came too soon, a knife edge of gray light under the thin curtain. "It's time," Luke said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. They moved with a quiet, grim purpose. There was no trace of the previous night's intimacy, only the sharp focus of survival. Luke dressed, his face tight as he pulled the shirt over his bandaged shoulder. Clara put on the simple cotton wedding dress. It felt different now. Not a disguise. It was a uniform, a statement. Luke checked his pistol, then slid it into the holster. He looked at her, his eyes taking in the dress, her hair, her face, which was pale but set. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," she said. "They'll be looking for a runaway girl in a ruined silk dress. They won't be looking for Mrs. Luke." He said the name with a strange, hard irony. He handed her a few coins. "We need clothes for you, something for the mountains. We'll go to the general store. Then the livery. We act normal. We act like we've got all the time in the world." He opened the door. The hotel was silent. They walked down the stairs, their boots loud on the wooden steps. The clerk from the night before was asleep, his head on the desk. He didn't stir. The street was cold, the air thin and sharp. A few people were moving about. A blacksmith was already at his forge, the sound of his hammer ringing clear. They walked side by side, not touching. They looked, Clara thought, like any other couple. The general store was warm, smelling of coffee beans, new denim, and cured tobacco. The storekeeper, the same man Luke had seen before, gave him a wary look but nodded a greeting. "My wife needs some things," Luke said, his voice casual. "Some sturdy breeches, a shirt, some socks, something warm." The storekeeper looked at Clara, at the white dress, and his eyebrows rose. A woman in a wedding dress, buying men's breeches at 7 in the morning. He was a discreet man. However, business was business. "Right this way, ma'am," he said, gesturing to a corner, as Clara was looking at a pair of canvas trousers. The sound of horses filled the street. Not one or two, a group. They were moving fast. Luke, who had been standing by the door, went still. His hand did not move to his gun, but his whole body became a single, coiled line of attention. "Stay here," he whispered, not looking at her. The horses stopped outside, directly in front of the store. Through the window, Clara saw them, 3 riders. One was Abernathy, the man from last night. He looked triumphant. The other 2 were strangers, hard-looking men in long dusters, their pistols tied low. They were gunmen. And the man in the center? He dismounted, his movements stiff and precise. He was tall, and he wore a fine, black broadcloth coat, unsuited for the trail. His face was pale, his features sharp, his eyes the color of a winter sky. He was perhaps 50 years old, but he carried himself with an authority that expected obedience. He looked at the town, his lip curled in distaste, as if he had just stepped in filth. It was him, it was Garrett. "Luke," Clara breathed, her blood turning to ice. "Get to the back of the store," Luke ordered, his voice low and sharp. "Now!" But it was too late. Garrett had seen Abernathy pointing, first at the hotel, and then at the general store. He turned, his cold eyes sweeping the interior through the window. He saw her. He saw the white dress. His face, which had been a mask of cold anger, contorted. It was a look of pure, possessive rage. He did not see a woman. He saw a stolen painting, a prize horse that had been taken from his stable. "Clara!" he boomed, his voice echoing in the street. He started for the door. "In here!" A voice called from the saloon across the street. It was Abernathy. "He's in here. Mr. Garrett. The murderer. Luke." Garrett stopped. His plan had just changed. He was not here to retrieve his property. He was here to exterminate a pest. He smiled, a thin, cruel expression, and turned. He and his two gunmen moved as one, walking across the street and pushing through the bat-wing doors of the saloon. The storekeeper was hiding behind the counter. "Mister, I don't want any trouble." Luke ignored him. He looked at Clara. She was trembling, her hand pressed to her mouth. The strength she had felt, the fire she had made, it was all gone, extinguished by the simple presence of that man. "He won't take you," Luke said, his voice fierce. He grabbed her arm. "This is not the barn. We're not trapped. We're going to walk out of here. We're going to the livery, and we're going to ride." "He'll kill you," she whispered. "He's going to try," Luke said. He pulled her toward the door. They stepped out onto the boardwalk. The street was suddenly quiet. The blacksmith's hammer had stopped. Faces peered from behind curtains. "There he is!" Abernathy shouted from the saloon doorway. Garrett stepped out onto the saloon porch, flanked by his two gunmen. He held a piece of paper in his hand. "That's him!" Garrett's voice was not a shout. It was a proclamation, meant to carry. "That man is Luke, a wanted murderer. There is a $500 reward for him, dead or alive. I have the warrant from Kansas." He was turning the town against them. He was not a fiancé. He was a bounty hunter, a bringer of justice. "He kidnapped this woman," Garrett continued, pointing at Clara. "My betrothed. He is a thief and a killer, and I am here to see him hang." Luke and Clara stood alone in the street, halfway between the store and the saloon. "Luke," Clara pleaded, pulling on his arm. "Run, please. You can get away. He just wants me." "No," Luke said, not looking at her. His eyes were locked on Garrett. "What's all this, then?" A new voice, deep and gravelly. The saloon owner. A large man with a heavy apron and a shotgun held loosely in one hand, stepped out. A few of the town's ranchers and miners followed him. Curious. "This man is a fugitive." "Sir," Garrett said, adopting a tone of civic duty, "I am placing him under citizen's arrest. My men and I will be taking him and the woman." "Is that so?" the saloon owner said. He looked at Luke. He looked at Clara, at the white dress, at the terror in her eyes. He looked at Garrett's expensive coat and his two paid gunmen. "This ain't Kansas, mister, and we don't much like bounty men coming into our town and throwing their weight around, especially for breakfast." A few of the men chuckled. The tension broke. Just a little. "I have a warrant," Garrett said, his voice rising, his patience gone. "Maybe you do," the owner said. "But I see 3 of you, all armed, and I see him and his wife. Seems like poor odds." "This is not your concern," Garrett spat. "It is when you start waving warrants and talking about killing," the owner said. He looked at Luke. "You got a name, son?" "Luke," Luke said, his voice steady. "And this your wife?" Luke's good hand found Clara's. He laced his fingers through hers. "She is." Garrett laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "His wife, that is Clara Thorne. She is my wife, by contract, signed by her father. This cur stole her. He stole my property." The word hung in the air. Property. The saloon owner's face hardened. The miners shifted. They didn't have much, but they were free men. They didn't like that word. And it was that word that broke Clara's fear. It was the spark to the tinder, the fire she had learned to make. She dropped Luke's hand and took a step forward. "Clara, no," Luke said. She ignored him. She stood in the middle of the muddy street, her small figure in the white dress a beacon against the brown world. She looked at Garrett, and then she looked at the saloon owner, at the miners, at the faces in the windows. "My name is Clara," she said, her voice shaking, but clear and loud. "And I am not his wife. I am not his property." Garrett's face went dark. "Clara, be silent. You are hysterical. Come here." "No," she said. She took another step. "I am not hysterical. I am telling the truth. My father fell into debt to this man." She pointed at Garrett. "A heavy debt, Mr. Garrett offered to forgive it in exchange for me." The street was dead silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "I was sold," Clara continued, her voice gaining strength, the shame burning away, replaced by a cold, clean fury. "I was a part of a business deal. I was to be handed over to him, like a deed to a house. In 2 days, I was not asked. I was told." She looked at Garrett, her eyes locking with his. "So I ran. I ran because I would rather die in a ditch than be owned by a man who would buy a person." The two gunmen looked uneasy. This was not what they had signed up for. Abernathy was sweating. "She is lying," Garrett roared. "She is a faithless, hysterical girl. She has been poisoned by this killer." "He is not a killer," Clara cried, turning back to the crowd. "He found me in a barn, in a storm, half dead. I was starving. He gave me his last piece of bread. He gave me his blanket. He protected me." She looked at Luke, and her expression softened. The entire town saw it. This was not a captive. This was a woman in love. "This man," she said, her voice dropping, thick with an emotion that no one could doubt, "is the only person in my entire life who has ever looked at me and seen a human being, not an object to be sold or a daughter to be bartered, a person. I am with him because I choose to be. I am his wife by my own choice, and you will not take me from him." She had signed his death warrant, and her own. Garrett was trembling, his face purple with a rage that went beyond reason. This was the ultimate humiliation. His property, his thing, was standing in a street, in a wedding dress, claiming another man. You whore," he whispered. He strode forward. He raised his hand, the heavy leather of his glove cutting through the air. He slapped her. The sound was sharp, brutal, like a gunshot. It snapped her head to the side. She stumbled, falling to her knees in the mud. Luke moved. He didn't make a sound. He crossed the 10 feet between them in 2 long, silent strides. He didn't punch. He didn't draw. He grabbed Garrett by the front of his fine coat with his left hand, his good hand. He lifted the man off his feet and threw him, bodily, backward. Garrett landed hard on his back in the mud, the air driven from his lungs. The two gunmen drew their pistols. "Boss!" But Luke was not looking at them. He was standing over Clara, shielding her, his body a bulwark. He looked at Garrett, his eyes not angry, but dead. A cold, flat, gray emptiness. "You don't," Luke said, his voice terrifyingly quiet. "Touch her." Garrett sat up, his coat and face covered in mud. The last shred of his dignity was gone. He was no longer a man of property. He was just a man in the dirt, and he was filled with murder. "Kill him!" he screamed, scrambling for his own pistol. "Kill him now! 500 for the man who kills him!" The two gunmen raised their pistols. "No!" the saloon owner roared, and he brought his shotgun up. "I said, this ain't your town. You stand down." The two gunmen hesitated, their eyes flickering between Luke and the armed, angry townsmen who were now leveling their own pistols. That hesitation was all Luke needed. He drew his pistol with his good right hand and dived to the side, rolling behind a water trough. Garrett, on his feet, fired. His shot went wild, smashing the window of the general store. The street erupted. The first gunman, ignoring the townsman, fired at Luke. The bullet splintered the trough. Luke, pinned, fired back from cover. A single, aimed shot. The gunman grunted, clutched his chest, and toppled forward. The second gunman, seeing his partner fall, turned his gun on the saloon owner. Clara, still on the ground, screamed, "No!" The saloon owner didn't have time to fire, but one of the miners did. His shot caught the second gunman in the leg. The man cried out, his pistol clattering on the boardwalk. It was over in 3 seconds. Abernathy had fled. The 2 gunmen were down. There was a silence, thick with gunpowder smoke. Luke slowly rose from behind the trough, his pistol still aimed at the surviving gunman. "It's finished. Garrett." Luke called out, "It's done. Leave." Garrett was standing alone in the middle of the street. His fine coat was ruined. His men were beaten. His property had defied him. He was breathing in great, ragged gasps. He looked at Clara, who was pushing herself to her feet. He looked at Luke. "It's finished," he whispered. "When you are in hell." He raised his pistol. He was a man of business, not a gunfighter. He was slow. Luke had him. Luke could have shot him 10 times. He held his fire. He did not want to kill him. "Don't," Luke said. But Garrett fired. The shot was wild, panicked, but it was not wild enough. Luke felt a massive, fiery blow to his right shoulder. It was not a graze. It was a sledgehammer. The force of it spun him around, his gun flying from his numb, useless hand. He collapsed, his right arm shattered, his vision tunneling to a single point of light. He was disarmed. He was dying. Garrett saw him fall. He saw the gun in the dirt. A slow, triumphant smile spread across his muddy face. He began to walk forward, raising his pistol for the killing shot. "Luke!" Clara screamed. Luke, on his back in the mud, his world consumed by white-hot pain, looked at her. She was running toward him. He had to. He fumbled at his belt with his left hand. His left, he was right-handed. His fingers found the grip of his revolver. He pulled it, the movement clumsy, agonizing. Garrett was 10 feet away, his gun level. "This," Garrett said, "is what happens to thieves." Luke, his vision blurry, his left hand shaking violently, raised the heavy pistol. He couldn't aim. He could only point. He fired. The explosion was dull, distant. Garrett stopped. He looked down at his own chest, at the dark, spreading stain on his white shirt. He looked up at Luke, his expression one of pure, blank confusion. He opened his mouth. No sound came out. He fell, face first, into the mud. For a full minute, the only sound was the wind and the quiet sobbing of the wounded gunman. Then, a drop of water hit Clara's cheek. She looked up. The sky, which had been a flat, indifferent gray, was opening. A light drizzle began to fall. The spell broke. Clara ran. She ignored Garrett's body, a still, dark shape in the street. She ran to Luke. He was on his back, his eyes closed, his face pale as death. His right arm was a ruin, and blood was pulsing from his shoulder, a bright, terrifying red. She fell to her knees, sliding in the slick, wet mud. "Luke!" she cried, grabbing his left hand. It was cold. "Luke, open your eyes. Please, stay with me." She grabbed his head, pulling it into her lap, cradling him against the white cotton of her dress. The rain began to fall harder, a steady, cold downpour. It plastered her hair to her face, mingling with her tears. It washed the gunpowder smoke from the air. She looked down. The bright red blood from his shoulder was swirling in the gathering puddles, mixing with the brown mud and the clean, cold rain, staining her wedding dress, turning the world to a watercolor of gray and red. "No," she whispered, rocking him, her voice a broken, animal sound. "No, no, please, no, you can't." You promised! He was still. His blood was on her hands, in her lap, mixing with the earth. The first thing he knew was pain. It was a distant, roaring ocean of fire, and he was floating in it. The second was the smell. Not gunpowder, not mud, not blood. It smelled of lye soap, clean linen, and dried herbs. Luke's eyes opened. The light was soft, filtered through a starched lace curtain. He was in a bed, a real bed, with a mattress that sank under his weight and sheets that were rough but clean. He tried to move, and the ocean of pain crashed over him. A sound, a low groan, was torn from his chest. His right arm was gone. He could not feel it. He could only feel the massive, blazing epicenter of its absence, high in his shoulder. He turned his head. Clara was asleep in a wooden chair by the bedside. She was not the woman from the barn, or the woman from the street. Her hair was clean, pulled back in a simple braid. She was wearing a plain, faded calico dress, not the white cotton. She was pale, with dark, bruised-looking circles under her eyes, and she was slumped in the chair, her head resting on her arms, which were folded on the edge of his bed. Her hand was inches from his. He had never seen anything so beautiful. He tried to move his left hand, to touch her, but even that small movement sent a jolt of agony through his body. He must have made another sound, because her head snapped up. Her eyes, bleary with sleep, widened. They were red-rimmed, but they were clear. She saw him. She saw he was awake. "Luke," she breathed. It was not a word. It was a prayer. She was on her feet, her hands hovering over him, afraid to touch. "You're awake! Oh, God, you're awake!" "Clara," he managed. His voice was a dry croak. His throat felt like it was full of dust. "Here." She seized a tin cup of water from the nightstand and slid her arm under his head. Lifting him, the movement was excruciating, but the water was life. It was cold and clean. "Where?" he rasped. "We're safe," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "We're in the town. A nurse. Her name is Maeve. She's been taking care of you." He looked at her, really looked at her. The exhaustion etched on her face. "How long?" 7 days, she whispered. "It's been 7 days since the street." 7 days. He had been gone from the world for a full week. He remembered the mud, Garrett's face, the impossible. Clumsy shot with his left hand, and then darkness. "Garrett," he said. "He's dead," Clara said, her voice flat, devoid of triumph, a simple statement of fact. You shot him. The other two, the gunmen, one is dead. The other is in the town jail." "My arm," he said, the fear finally cutting through the fog. He tried to lift it. Nothing happened. He looked down. It was there. A huge, shapeless bundle of white bandages, strapped tightly across his chest. "The bullet," she said, her voice trembling. "It shattered the bone. The doctor, Doc Holloway, he did what he could. He said you were lucky. It missed the artery." She met his eyes, her own full of a pain that mirrored his. "He said you'll live, but he said you won't be a gunman again. Your right arm, it will be weak, scarred." He closed his eyes. His gun hand, the hand that had defined him, fed him, protected him, gone. He was a cripple. "It doesn't matter," Clara said, her voice fierce, as if she'd heard his thoughts. She grabbed his left hand, her grip desperate. "You're alive. Do you hear me? You're alive." He opened his eyes and looked at her. She was not a prisoner. She was not property. She was free, and he was alive. "Yeah," he whispered, "I'm alive." The door opened, and a woman entered. She was older, in her 50s, with an iron-gray hair pulled into a tight bun and the most sensible, no-nonsense face Luke had ever seen. This was Nurse Maeve. "Well, now," she said, her voice brisk. "Look who decided to rejoin the living. You've had this poor girl worried sick. She hasn't left this chair for more than an hour a day, for 7 days. Clara blushed, pulling her hand back, but Luke didn't let go. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. "Don't thank me. Thank her. She's the one who sat with you, who boiled the linens, who fed you broth you didn't even know you were swallowing." Maeve bustled over, putting a hand on Luke's forehead. "Fever's broken. That's good. You're a tough one, I'll give you that." She turned to Clara. "Now you, child, go, get some food that isn't stale bread and walk in the sun. I'll watch him." Clara hesitated. "Go," Luke said, squeezing her hand. "It's all right. I'm not going anywhere." She finally nodded, gave him one last look, and left the room. Maeve watched her go, then turned back to Luke. "She's a good one. What happened in that street? Well, this town hasn't seen the like." What's the law say?" Luke asked, the old, familiar tension returning. "Ah, yes, Sheriff Brody," Maeve said, changing the bandage on his shoulder. The pain was sharp, but he gritted his teeth. "He's been waiting. He's a fair man. He'll want your side of it." Sheriff Brody came an hour later. He was a tall, lean man with a sun-scorched face and thoughtful eyes. He did not look like a man who was easily fooled. He pulled up a chair. "Mr. Luke," he said, "good to see you awake. You caused quite a stir." "Wasn't my intention." Luke said, "No, I reckon not." Brody took out a small notebook. "I've spoken to just about everyone. The saloon owner, Josiah, the miners, your wife." He said the word without inflection. "I've got a clear picture, but I need your words for the report. Start from the beginning. Why was Garrett hunting you?" Luke stared at the ceiling. He had spent his life running from the law, lying to it. Now, he had no reason to lie. He was tired, and his gun arm was useless. So he told him. He told him about Elias Thorne, the ambush, the warrant. He told him about running, about the barn, about the storm. "And the girl?" Brody asked. "She was telling the truth." Luke said every word. "She was running from him. I got in the way." "You did more than that. You took on 3 gunmen in a street fight to protect her, one of whom you'd never met." "He hit her," Luke said, his voice flat. "That's all." Brody looked at him for a long, silent moment. "Garrett's men, the one in my jail, he's talking. Says Garrett hired them in Kansas. Told them he was hunting a fugitive and retrieving his wife. They were paid $200 apiece." "And Abernathy, the one who saw me?" "Fled," Brody said. "Slipped out of town during the fight. Smart man." He closed his notebook. "The warrant from Kansas. It's real. For murder. For the ambush. Says you killed Elias Thorne's partners." Luke's heart went cold. "I told you. It was an ambush. Thorne killed them. I shot Thorne. In the leg. To get away. I didn't kill anyone who wasn't trying to kill me first." "I believe you," Brody said. "And I don't much care. That's a Kansas problem. My problem is what happened here. And what happened here. By the testimony of no less than 10 men. Is that Mr. Garrett, a civilian, attempted to incite a riot. He assaulted a woman, and he fired on you after you were disarmed and wounded. His death was self-defense, and the death of his gunman was defense of your own life. As far as Aspen Ridge is concerned, Mr. Luke, you are a free man." Luke let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for 5 years. "Free. Now," Brody said, standing up. "There's the matter of the woman." Clara was waiting outside. Brody called her in. She stood by Luke's bed, her hands clasped. "Ma'am," Brody said, his voice gentle, "we found papers on Mr. Garrett's body, and we went through his things at the hotel. We found the marriage contract you spoke of." Clara flinched. "It is exactly as you said." Brody continued. "It is a transfer of property, land, cattle, and you. It is not a legal marriage certificate. It was never filed with the county, never sanctified by a preacher. It was a bill of sale. The town, he explained, had been horrified. The women, especially, had taken up Clara's cause. Legally, ma'am, you are not, and never were, his wife. You were a ward of your father, and he made an illegal contract. Mr. Garrett's death, while unfortunate, has rendered that contract void, and given his actions, abduction, assault, attempted murder, no court in this territory would enforce it. You are free. Clara swayed. Luke's left hand found hers and held on tight. Free. The word was so big, it filled the whole room. What about my father? She whispered. That's in Kansas. Brody said, there's nothing he can do to you here. You are, by the laws of Colorado, your own woman. He paused. There's the matter of Garrett's body, and his men, and his belongings. He has no family, as far as we can tell. The town. We took the liberty. We used the money in his wallet to pay for the burials, and to pay for the window at the general store. He looked at Luke. There was also the matter of the $500 reward he offered, the one on your head. Luke tensed. Seems to me, Brody said, a small smile playing on his lips, that you're the one who killed Garrett. So, I suppose, you're the one who earned the reward. The town council agrees. He placed a heavy leather pouch on the nightstand. That's what was left, after paying for Doc Holloway, and for Nurse Maeve's troubles, and for the broken window. It comes to $312. Luke stared at the money. It was more than he had seen in 2 years. Consider it a civic fee, Brody said, for cleaning up a problem. Now, I suggest you two rest. Maeve says you'll be on your back for another 2 weeks. Son, but the town is grateful. You're welcome here. He tipped his hat and left. Clara sank into the chair, her face in her hands. She began to cry. Not the sobs of terror or grief, but the deep, shuddering, cleansing tears of release. Luke just held her hand, his heart too full for words. The next 2 weeks were a strange, quiet dream. Luke healed, slowly, painfully. His right arm was, as the doctor had predicted, a ruin. The muscles were torn, the bone was knit crookedly. He would have use of it, perhaps enough to lift a cup or hold a book. But not a gun, not an axe, not the reins of a horse. He had to learn to do everything with his left hand. Clara taught him. She sat with him, day after day. She cut his food, and when he was strong enough, she put the fork in his left hand and guided it, her patience endless as he fumbled. She helped him dress, her fingers gentle as she buttoned his shirt. This intimacy was new. It was not the desperate, frantic coupling of the barn or the hotel. It was the quiet, steady rhythm of care. He, who had always been the protector, was now the one being protected. He was dependent. And he found, to his astonishment, that it was not a prison. It was a different kind of freedom. He was no longer Luke, the killer. He was just Luke, Clara's Luke. The town, as promised, was good to them. The saloon owner, Josiah, brought him a bottle of good whiskey. The miners' wives brought them meals. They were the town heroes, a living, breathing dime novel. When Luke was finally strong enough to walk, leaning heavily on Clara, they stepped out into the bright, cold mountain air. What now? He asked. The $300 felt heavy in his pocket. It wasn't enough to start a ranch. It was barely enough to get them to the next town. I saw something, Clara said, her cheeks pink with the cold. When I was on my walks. A place. She led him up the hill behind the town, past the small church, past the last houses. They followed a goat track up into the pines, and there, in a small clearing overlooking the entire valley, was a cabin. It was small, barely one room, and it was derelict. The roof had a hole, the windows were gone, and the door was off its hinges. It had been an old prospector's claim, abandoned years ago. It's a wreck, Luke said. But look, she said. She pointed not at the cabin, but at the view. The valley spread out below them, a quilt of green and gold, the river a silver ribbon. The mountains rose up, blue and purple, against the sky. It was the most peaceful place he had ever seen. The land is unclaimed, she said. Brody told me. Anyone can file for it. And the cabin, the wood is good. It just needs work. He looked at her. She was not a lady of property. She was a pioneer. It will be hard work, he said, looking at his useless right arm. Then at his clumsy left. I am not afraid of work, she said, her eyes shining. And you have 2 arms. One is just different. I will be your right hand. They bought the claim for $10. They spent $200 on supplies, a new stove, window glass, a real bed, flour, salt, bacon, coffee. They bought an axe, a hammer, and nails. And they bought a mule. The work was brutal. Luke, with his one good arm, was clumsy and slow. He could swing the axe, but awkwardly, and it exhausted him. He cursed in frustration, the simple act of driving a nail a monument to his new weakness. Clara, as promised, was his right hand. She held the boards while he sawed. She climbed the roof, nimble as a cat, to patch the holes he could not reach. She learned to mix mud and straw for chinking. He taught her everything he knew, and she learned with a fierce, bright intelligence. They worked from sunrise to sunset. They were not building a house, they were building a life, with every nail, every log. In the evenings, they would sit on the new porch, watching the sun set over the valley. They were too tired to talk, but it was a shared, satisfied silence. Clara made the cabin a home. She planted wildflowers, dug up from the meadow, in a small box by the steps. She learned to bake bread. Her first attempts were rocks, but Luke ate every crumb. She scrubbed the floors, hung curtains made from bleached flour sacks, and made the small room bright. One day, he found her sitting on the porch, a white bundle in her lap. It was the dress, the wedding dress. She had scrubbed it clean, the mud was gone, but the bloodstains, his blood, remained, faded to a pale, rust color. I was going to burn it, she said, her fingers tracing the faded stain. It's a memory of him. It's not, Luke said, sitting beside her. He touched the cloth with his left hand. That's not his dress. That's the dress you wore when you stood in the street, the dress you wore when you won, the dress you were wearing when you saved my life. He looked at her. And it's the dress you wore when you came to me in the hotel. It's not his, Clara. It's yours. It's ours. She looked at the dress and then at him, a slow, deep understanding in her eyes. She folded it, carefully, and put it away in a small wooden chest he had built for her, a memento. Winter came. The mountains turned white. The cabin was small, but it was tight and warm. The fire in the new stove was a constant, cheerful roar. They were alone, together, on their hill. One night, the wind was howling outside, a high, lonely sound. But inside, the fire was bright. Clara was reading a book she had borrowed from Nurse Maeve. Luke was sitting in his chair, staring into the flames. He had been quiet all evening. He was looking at his right hand, which rested, pale and scarred, on his knee. He could move the fingers, but the grip was weak, a ghost of what it had been. Luke, she asked, putting her book down. What is it? He was silent for a long time. I've been thinking, he said, his voice low, about the barn, that second night. Clara went very still. The things you said, he continued, not looking at her. When you were scared, when you turned to me, she knew. Please stop. I can only take 3 inches in. The words were a scar, a memory of a time that felt a world away. I've been thinking on those words, he said. He finally looked at her, his gray eyes clear and deep in the firelight. You were right to be scared. You were testing me, to see if I was like him, to see if I would take... He reached out his good left hand and pulled her chair closer. He took her hand. The first 3 inches, he said, his voice rough. That was your fear. That was for you to run. That was the part of your life that belonged to Garrett, to your father, the part you had to escape. She stared at him, her heart filling her throat. The rest, he said, his voice softening, his thumb stroking her knuckles. All the rest, that was for you to stay. It was not a statement. It was a question. It was the last piece of his broken, outlaw heart, offered in his clumsy, left-handed way. Clara felt a smile, slow and warm, spread across her face, the last of the shadows, the last of the running. Finally, truly, fell away. She let go of his hand, moved from her chair, and curled up on the floor, resting her head in his lap, her face turned toward the fire. She felt his good hand come to rest in her hair, his scarred hand settle on her shoulder. She was home. I'm staying, she whispered, her voice muffled against the rough denim of his jeans. I'm staying forever. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please let us know in the comments below. We love connecting with our audience. Be sure to subscribe to From Wild West, and please share your thoughts on Clara and Luke's journey.